This is a story set in Breckenridge, Colorado, during a zombie outbreak, a resort lockdown, a blackout, a network collapse, and a supply shortage. And I am a night shift ski resort maintenance worker trapped on the mountain campus, trying to hold the lifts, the lodge, the diesel, the food, and the staff together until an official safe corridor opens. The first time I died, I did it on a catwalk outside the gondola motor room, with a flashlight in one hand and a service key in the other. I had worked nights at that resort for almost 8 years, long enough to know every sound it made in the cold. The gondola station groaned when the wind came down off the ridge. The chairlift towers hummed when the cables were under tension. The base lodge had two kinds of echo, the open one from the lobby and the thin, hollow one from the service hall. The mountain smelled like pine resin, frozen snow, diesel exhaust, wet wool, and the warm dust of machinery that never really slept. That mattered because my job was to keep the resort alive after dark. I checked lift motors. I logged temperatures. I cleared ice from stair rails. I tested backup power. I knew which door stuck if the snow drift got too high, which generator bled fuel too fast, and which lift alarm meant a cable had lost tension, and which one meant somebody had simply failed to close a panel right. On the night I died, the mountain already felt wrong. The first warning came through the resort radio on the desk in the maintenance office. 2 violent patients at the clinic in town. A shuttle delay. A request from security to keep the lodge lobby clear because somebody had bitten a transit guard near the bus stop. At first it sounded like the kind of bad night mountain towns get every winter. Then the details got worse. Another screaming patient. A call from the emergency desk. A shaky video from the base terminal showing a man in a ski jacket throwing himself at a glass door like he wanted through it more than he wanted air. I remember hearing the shouting before I saw anything. It came from the lift control corridor just beyond the service hatch by the gondola station. Somebody was yelling for help. Somebody else was yelling not to open the door. I knew the voice of the lift operator who called out because he was the one who always brought me extra coffee on storm nights. He sounded terrified. I should have checked the camera first. I should have looked at the corner through the window before I moved. Instead, I stepped out of the office with my flashlight in one hand and my key ring in the other. The service hatch at the end of the catwalk was already open a few inches. The yellow strip light above it was flickering. I could hear boots on metal. I could hear somebody crying inside the lift room. I thought maybe one of the workers had slipped. Maybe a guest had gotten lost in the back hall. Maybe it was one of those ugly nights where panic outruns facts, and people need a door held or a cable reset, or a voice to tell them where to stand. Then the infected came around the stacked tool bins. I remember the face more than the body. Gray skin, red-rimmed eyes, frost on the shoulders of a patrol jacket that was soaked through. Its hands were already reaching before its feet finished moving. I remember the first impact when it hit me, and the stupid, unreal fact that my flashlight skittered across the catwalk grating and kept shining upward. I remember the scream from inside the lift room and the sound of my own shoulder slamming the rail. Then my boot slipped on the ice crust on the grating. My elbow hit the wall. The hatch opened wider than it should have. The infected got just enough room to grab me, and I understood in one clean second that I had trusted a voice before I checked the angle. When I woke again, I was sitting in the maintenance office with a half-cold cup of coffee beside the keyboard and the wall clock reading 5:11 a.m. I did not move for almost a full minute. The heater in the office was ticking softly. A chairlift outside was making its slow-loading clack against the station. Somewhere in the lodge, a dish cart rolled once and stopped. My hands were clean. No blood. No bite marks. The dispatch screen on the desk was lit. The date on the security monitor showed 1 week earlier. I checked it twice. Then I checked the radio, the camera feed, and the log on my phone. Same mountain weather. Same lodge chatter. Same warnings, but not yet at the point where the whole thing had gone wrong. Not a dream. Not a seizure. Not a blackout from too much coffee. A second chance. I did not know why I had been handed one. I did not stop to argue with the logic of it. I had already watched the bad ending once. That was enough to make the morning feel like somebody had loaded a rifle in the next room. By 6, I was counting the resort like inventory. The base lodge had the front lobby, the kitchen, the staff break room, 2 stairwells, the rental counter, the first floor storage closet, and the service hall that ran toward the gondola station. The gondola station itself had the loading bay, the control room, the catwalk, the lift motor access, and the switchgear panel. The generator hall sat behind the maintenance wing. The snowcat garage held the plows and the fuel drums. The staff housing cabins sat uphill behind the lodge, linked by a service path that got icy when the wind picked up. I knew all of it because I had spent years moving through it with checklists and keys and snow boots. That knowledge was the only reason I had a chance. If the mountain closed, then the service hall, the gondola station, the generator room, and the staff housing would be the only places that mattered. Everything else would be either a route or a trap. I wrote that down on the back of a maintenance form and started a list of what I would need if the town went bad before the week was out. Food first, water first, medicine, batteries, light, tape, trash bags, markers, a pry bar, spare gloves, blackout fabric for the office windows, something to hold the lodge doors shut, anything that could turn a resort full of strangers into a set of rooms I could predict. By 7, I had my badge on and my tool cart loaded. I started with the lodge kitchen because I knew exactly what the overnight freezer stock looked like, and because the executive chef owed me a favor I was ready to collect. I took sealed crackers, instant oatmeal cups, canned soup, peanut butter, tuna packets, powdered drink mix, coffee, tea, sugar packets, and a stack of plastic bowls and spoons meant for the employee break area. I did not take anything that needed a freezer. I did not take anything I could not count by hand. Then I moved to the staff pantry and filled the cart with bottled water, electrolyte packets, granola bars, and 2 cases of juice boxes that were technically for the kids' ski school but would become useful if adults started making bad decisions under stress. At the town market below the resort, I found half the shelves still full and half the customers already too nervous to pretend it was normal. One man in a ski parka was buying cans of beans like he expected a storm to stay for a month. A woman with 2 children had filled a cart with bread, apples, rice, and bottled water. She looked ashamed of the volume of what she was buying, which meant she had already crossed the point where shame mattered less than preparation. I kept my lists small and my movements boring. At the pharmacy counter, I bought fever reducers, pain relievers, anti-diarrhea tablets, antihistamines, adhesive bandages, gauze, tape, gloves, masks, alcohol wipes, thermometers, and antiseptic. I added a small bottle of iodine and 2 packs of saline flushes because I had learned long ago that the boring supplies disappear before the dramatic ones. At the hardware store, I bought batteries, 2 LED lanterns, 3 headlamps, a pry bar, duct tape, zip ties, a utility knife, a hammer, a folding cart, a box of padlocks, and a roll of heavy plastic sheeting that would be useful for blocking windows and office glass. The clerk asked me if I was preparing for a blizzard. I almost said yes. Instead, I told him the mountain always changed fast, which was close enough to the truth to keep him from asking anything else. When I got back to the resort, I did not take the gondola. I hauled the first load up the stairs to remind myself where the weak points were. That was a mistake I knew better than to make, but the feel of the building under my boots mattered. On the second landing, I stopped and listened. I heard the snow groomer outside in the lower lot. I heard the dish cart in the kitchen. I heard a gust of wind bump the lodge windows. Nothing was broken yet. That was the worst part. Disaster always feels late until the exact second it arrives. I spent the rest of the morning turning the maintenance office into a room that could be defended. The mezzanine windows got blackout fabric first, then tape around the edges. Then a shelf moved in front of the lower panes so no one could see movement from the street. I put the flashlight, radio, notebook, batteries, and knife on the desk where I could reach them without standing. I taped a mountain map to the wall and marked the lodge, the gondola station, the generator room, the snowcat garage, the staff cabins, and the route to the roof access. The maintenance office became the core zone. The gondola control room became the supply zone. The service hall became the buffer zone. The service hatch at the lift catwalk became the line I would not cross unless I had to. I had just finished the labels when Lena Ortiz knocked on the service hatch from the ski patrol side. She was the patrol medic on night watch, and she had the kind of face that made people listen before she raised her voice. I knew her mostly from Frozen Fingers, avalanche reports, and the occasional complaint when the radios were missing from the patrol sled. She held up a temperature printout and a paper cup of coffee. I opened the hatch only enough to take the paper through. She did not smile. She asked me if I was hearing the same reports she was hearing from town clinic and the shuttle depot. I told her yes. She told me that a patient had bitten a security guard at the bus terminal, that another had turned violent at the clinic, and that the emergency desk was already telling staff to avoid the waiting room unless they had to cross it. She did not sound like gossip. She sounded like somebody reporting an alarm. I asked her if she thought it was infection. She looked at me and said it was too ugly to be anything else. That was the first time I heard another person say the exact thing I had already learned by dying. I told her I was going to secure the lodge and generator room before the day got worse. She told me that if the lights went out, the lodge lobby would become a funnel and not a room, and that anyone who still believed the lifts were safe was going to get hurt. I wrote that down on the back of the temperature sheet. By late afternoon, the news tone shifted. At first the alerts were careful: temporary shuttle delays, a request to avoid the terminal, emergency room overload. Then the language got flatter and more urgent. Stay inside if possible. Conserve power. Delay non-essential travel. Expect disruptions in communications and delivery. The bars on my phone flickered, then dipped, then came back weak enough to feel insulting. When I carried the last card into the maintenance office, the building already felt different. Not the weather. The building. The corridor noise had thinned into a tense quiet. The gondola station had stopped making its usual low hum. Voices from the lodge below were muffled and too distant to trust. Down in the generator hall, a relay clicked once and then stayed silent. I was finishing my count sheet when the first flicker hit. The office lights blinked, then blinked again. Then they stayed dim just long enough to make the whole lodge feel like it had shifted an inch to the left. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert before the signal disappeared. Stay indoors. Avoid the mountain district. Reports of violent incidents and communications disruption. Shelter in place if you can. That was the official language. The meaning was much simpler. The town had started to let go. I moved on instinct. I shut the office door, dropped the chain, and shoved the tool cart sideways so it blocked the line of sight from the hall. I pulled the blackout fabric tighter over the windows. I dragged the water cases closer to the desk. Anything that could be used as a barrier had to be near enough to use before fear changed its shape. Then I listened. The lodge spoke in layers once the main power failed. The heater in the walls wound down. The gondola drive system settled with a low metallic groan. Doors opened and shut. Somebody outside shouted for a driver to move his truck. A child cried once and was hushed. A man in the lobby kept repeating that his wife was still downstairs in the terminal building. The emergency strips came on a few seconds later, weak and amber along the floor, enough to keep people from tripping and not enough to make anybody feel safe. I heard Wade Collins before I saw him. He was the snowcat mechanic and mountain operations lead for the resort, a broad-shouldered man in a grease-stained jacket who always looked like he had already fixed 3 problems before breakfast and expected 3 more after midnight. He came through the generator hall with a flashlight in one hand and a ring of keys in the other, and he looked at the deadened maintenance office as if he had been waiting for this exact hour. "You got fuel enough?" he asked. I said yes, but not enough to waste. He nodded once and told me to keep it tight. The mountain radio came on after that, weak with static. Power failures, road closures, resort restrictions. Then a second voice, calmer than the first, said the mountain should prepare for controlled lockdown if the situation worsened. I looked at Wade. He looked at the lift status board. Neither of us liked how neatly the pieces were fitting together. The first pounding on the lodge doors came just before dark. Not the office door. The front lodge doors. The sound rolled through the building like a drum hitting concrete. Someone shouted from the lobby. Another voice answered. Then a third. A metal crash rang out from the direction of the gondola catwalk, followed by the wet dragging noise I remembered from my death. I did not go up to check. I did not open anything. I stayed in the office with the pry bar on the desk and the flashlight turned low, and I listened long enough to know the difference between panic and impact. Somebody hit the stairwell door once, then again. A woman cried out for help. Then the voices broke apart into running feet, shouted names, and the ugly silence that comes when a hallway becomes a trap. That was the moment the resort stopped being my workplace and started being my bunker. Near midnight, Lena called me on the internal radio from the patrol room. The signal was weak and staticky, but her voice made it through. She asked if I could hear the lodge doors on my side. I said yes. She told me to keep the lift control room shut and to stop anybody from using the catwalk unless they had a second person verifying the route. She said the infected were moving in the resort corridors now, but not all of them were moving fast. Some were still upright enough to reach a landing or a door if they got lucky. One weak person in a narrow space could still kill you if you trusted the gap. I had already learned that once. I told her I was going to keep the lodge locked. She said good. Then she asked whether I had extra bottled water, because the patrol room was already seeing the beginning of a water pressure drop, and the staff sink in the locker corridor was starting to run brown. I sent 2 cases through the service hatch with Wade 30 minutes later. In return, Lena sent me a box of masks, a bottle of antiseptic, and a note written in the careful block letters she used for avalanche tags. Watch for fever, confusion, red eyes, unsteady walking, sudden aggression. I pinned the note over my count sheet and left it there where I could see it. The next morning was not really morning. It was just a gray thinning in the light through the office fabric. The power had not returned. The lifts were dead. The shuttle announcements had gone silent. Somewhere in the building, a generator had kicked on for a few seconds, then settled into a hesitant cycle that sounded too weak to trust. The smell in the lodge had changed too. More wet concrete, more stale air, less of the clean industrial scent the resort usually had, and more of the smell of a place starting to hold its own waste. That was how I knew the water problem had become real. The taps still worked if you waited long enough, but the pressure was thin and uneven. One sink in the break room spit brown water for 2 seconds before clearing. A toilet near the locker line made a hollow gurgling sound and refused to refill properly. Wade swore softly and said the booster line probably could not hold pressure if the upper floors kept pulling at the same time. I began separating clean water from everything else. Drink water in one corner. Cook water in another. Wash water in the break room sink with a labeled bucket beneath it. It looked obsessive until the resort got worse. Then it looked normal. Lena came to the service hatch in person the first time after the blackout and stood in the doorway with her flashlight clipped to her collar and the tired expression of someone who had spent the last 12 hours trying to keep frightened people from panicking at the same time. She asked how much water I had left. I told her enough for 3 days if I stayed disciplined. She nodded and said that was better than the patrol room upstairs. Then she gave me the first real medical list I had heard since the outbreak started to turn its teeth toward us. Watch for confusion. Watch for unsteady movement. Watch for red eyes and sudden aggression. Do not mistake fever weakness for safety. The infected could still climb stairs, cross a landing, or follow a sound even when they looked half gone. I asked her how many people in the lodge had symptoms. She said enough to make the crew nervous and not enough to make the floor safe. That was the sort of answer that told the truth without pretending to be comfortable. We both went quiet for a second after that. There was nothing else to say that would help. After dark, someone started pounding on the lodge doors from the outside. At first I thought it was a guest who had not gotten the warning in time. Then I heard a man shouting through the glass for us to let him in because he had a sister in the staff housing, and the road was full of people running. 2 seconds later, a second voice joined him, and then a third, and I realized it was a small group of strangers who had found the resort because ski lodges are where desperate people think answers might still be. Before I could answer, something hit the outer fence hard enough to rattle the chain. I moved to the camera monitor and looked through the grainy feed. A man in a torn ski jacket was stumbling along the lot with the stiff, wrong gait I remembered from my death. Not fast. Not coordinated. Just wrong enough to make the people at the gate scatter. The group outside began shouting at one another. One wanted the door open. One wanted to run. One said there were more coming down the access road. Then the infected reached the fence line, and that was all the argument the night needed. The people outside fled. I did not open the gate. I did not run after them. I hit the manual lock, dropped the chain across the inner doors, and pulled the pallet jack into the line behind it. Wade shoved a supply cart into place on the opposite side. The whole line held because we made it hold, and because panic is often enough to make people create the exact confusion that kills them. After that, I wrote new rules on the mountain map. No one opened a door alone. No one used the lift catwalk as a shortcut. No one crossed the service hall if they had not been checked by somebody else first. No one borrowed reserve supplies without writing it down. No one answered a voice at the gate if the person speaking could not be seen in full light. Lena approved every one of those rules through the service hatch. Wade grunted at them and said I was starting to sound like a night supervisor. I told him the supervisor was dead or unreachable and that I was fine with either answer as long as the doors stayed closed. By the end of the first 2 days, the resort had become smaller. Not physically. The campus was still huge, but the useful parts had narrowed. The office, the lift control room, the generator hall, the break room, the staff corridor. Those were the places that mattered now. The rest was either a route to somewhere safer or a place to avoid. That was the shape of the first crisis. Close the door. Count the fuel. Listen to the lifts. Keep the supplies together. Do not trust noise. Do not trust the first story the mountain tells you about itself. Outside, sleet kept falling on Breckenridge, Colorado. Inside, the resort started becoming a place you could only hold if you accepted its limits. That became clearer on the third day, when Wade took me down to the generator room. The room sat behind a steel door marked authorized personnel only. Inside, the air smelled like hot metal, old diesel and dust baked onto wiring by years of use. The backup generator was larger than I liked. It sat in the middle of the concrete floor with fuel lines, transfer switches, and a panel of blinking indicators that looked too cheerful for the amount of trouble they were hiding. Wade crouched beside the side cover and pointed out the fault relay that had tripped when the blackout hit the mountain grid. "If we can get one more clean cycle out of this unit," he said, "the lodge stays lit, the lift control room keeps power, and the radio keeps talking. If not, we are doing this in the dark much sooner than I want." I handed him the flashlight and kept the beam on the panel. He did not waste words. He opened the cover, reseated a contact, and showed me the manual bypass for the one line most likely to fail again. I held the light steady and stayed out of his way. That was the real work. Do not invent a better plan than the man with the wrench. Do not touch the wrong cable because you think confidence counts as training. The generator shuddered when he restarted it. Then it held. The lights over the lodge office came back to life in a weak, useful strip. The corridor behind us stopped feeling like a cave. The resort radio on my belt picked up a stronger signal. It was not a victory. It was just one more hour we had bought. I wrote the repair in my notebook and added the fuel level beside it. That was how the days started to work. One count at a time. One system at a time. By the fourth day, the water pressure began to fail in a way that was too obvious to ignore. At first it was a thin stream from the sink in the break room. Then the toilet near the locker corridor stopped refilling properly. Then one of the taps in the ski patrol washroom spat air and brown water before clearing. The smell changed first. Mountain lodges are built to hide smell. When they fail in the nose before anywhere else. I put a bucket under the break room sink, labeled it clean water, and divided everything else into strict categories. Drink water, cook water, wash water, emergency water. It looked obsessive until the resort got worse. Then it looked normal. Lena started leaving notes in the service hatch slot because she did not want to rely on the phones if the network collapsed completely. Her notes were brief and exact. Watch for fever. Watch for confusion. Watch for red eyes and sudden aggression. Do not mistake exhaustion for safety. A weak person in a narrow corridor can still kill you if you trust the gap. She was right, and she knew it. That evening she came to the hatch in person. She was wearing a mask, a headlamp clipped to her collar, and the expression of someone who had spent 12 hours trying to keep frightened people from panicking at the same time. She asked me how much water I had left. I told her 3 days if I stayed disciplined. She nodded and said that was better than the patrol room, which was already rationing cups by shift. Then she handed me a box of gloves, a small bottle of antiseptic, and 2 packets of saline flushes. I gave her bottled water and a case of crackers. Neither of us smiled. We did not need to. That exchange mattered because it showed where the trust line sat. We could help each other. We could not pretend the resort was safe enough for generosity without boundaries. The first real infection pressure inside the mountain campus came on the 5th night. Someone started pounding on the gondola station door from the outside just after midnight. At first I thought it was a guest who had not gotten the warning in time. Then I heard a man shouting through the glass for us to let him in, because he had a daughter in staff housing, and the access road was full of people running. 2 seconds later, a second voice joined him, and then a third, and I realized it was a small group of strangers who had found the resort because ski resorts are where desperate people think answers might still be sitting in a warm room. Before I could answer, something hit the outer fence hard enough to rattle the chain. I moved to the camera monitor and looked through the grainy feed. A man in a torn ski jacket was stumbling along the lot with the stiff, wrong gait I remembered from my death. Not fast. Not coordinated. just wrong enough to make the people at the gate scatter. The group outside began shouting at one another. One wanted the door open. One wanted to run. One said there were more coming down the access road. Then the infected reached the fence line, and that was all the argument the night needed. The people outside fled. I did not open the gate. I did not run after them. I hit the manual lock, dropped the chain across the inner doors, and pulled the pallet jack into the line behind it. Wade shoved a supply cart into place on the opposite side. The whole line held because we made it hold, and because panic is often enough to make people create the exact confusion that kills them. After that, I wrote new rules on the mountain map. No one opened a door alone. No one used the lift catwalk as a shortcut. No one crossed the service hall if they had not been checked by somebody else first. No one borrowed reserve supplies without writing it down. No one answered a voice at the gate if the person speaking could not be seen in full light. Lena approved every one of those rules through the hatch. Wade grunted at them and said I was starting to sound like a night supervisor. I told him the supervisor was dead or unreachable, and that I was fine with either answer as long as the doors stayed closed. By the end of the first 2 days, the resort had become smaller. Not physically. The campus was still huge. But the useful parts had narrowed. The office, the lift control room, the generator hall, the break room, the service hall. Those were the places that mattered now. The rest was either a route to somewhere safer or a place to avoid. That was the shape of the first crisis. Close the door. Count the fuel. Listen to the lifts. Keep the supplies together. Do not trust noise. Do not trust the first story the mountain tells you about itself. Outside, sleet kept falling on Breckenridge, Colorado. Inside, the resort started becoming a place you could only hold if you accepted its limits. That became clearer on the 6th day, when I could smell the sanitation problem before I saw it. The toilets were filling too slowly. The break room sink had begun to spit brownish water on the first pull of the handle. The service hall smelled like damp wool, old bleach, and the wet fiberglass smell that means snow has been tracked too far indoors. Trash bags were piling up faster than the lodge wanted to admit, and the waste chute was no longer a place anybody wanted to stand near for long. I put absorbent material in the waste bin, lined it with 2 bags, and moved it into the far corner of the maintenance office. I set out a roll of paper towels, a box of gloves, a bottle of cleaner, and a marker so nobody had to guess what to use. It did not solve the smell. It just gave the smell a container. Lena came down once to check the temperature of a patient who had started shaking in staff housing. She did not ask me to come with her. She asked if I had any extra batteries for the handheld thermometers, and whether I could spare one of the LED lanterns for the patrol room because the overhead light there had failed for the 3rd time. I gave her both. She gave me something more useful than gratitude. She told me the crew had started seeing people who were not technically workers yet. Family members who had arrived to check on relatives, stranded skiers, a shuttle driver who had been in the wrong place when the road shutdown started. Every one of them believed the resort was the safest point on the mountain. That made the place more crowded and less safe at the same time. We both understood the math. The base was strong only if the traffic stayed controlled. That is why I agreed to the supply run on the 7th morning. We needed more antiseptic, more fuel stabilizer, 1 more box of masks, and a replacement battery pack for the radio. The inside stock could last a little longer, but not forever. Wade wanted to go with me because he knew the mountain roads. Lena wanted us back before the afternoon because the crowd near the lodge doors was getting harder to manage. None of us liked the idea. That was exactly why we did it. We left through the maintenance exit at first light. Breckenridge looked interrupted. Sleet had turned the streets into dark gray mirrors. Traffic lights blinked uselessly over empty intersections. A town shuttle sat crooked in the lane with no driver in sight. 2 snowboards were tipped on their sides near a curb, as if someone had dropped them and never come back. The sidewalks were wet, scattered with paper cups, loose flyers, and the kind of debris that builds when a town stops telling its people where to go. We moved by side streets and service alleys because the main roads were already too full of abandoned cars. The first market we checked had its front glass shattered and a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Limit 1 per customer," in the deadest handwriting I had ever seen. The shelves inside were not empty yet, but they were close enough to make me slower. Empty shelves mean somebody got there first. Half-empty shelves mean somebody else will be back. I took antiseptic wipes, iodine, pain relievers, anti-diarrhea tablets, adhesive bandages, a pack of gloves, and 2 boxes of masks. Wade found a rack of batteries in the wrong aisle and grabbed every package that still had a seal on it. At the back of the store, we heard a crash from the stockroom door. Both of us froze. The second sound was worse. A dragging noise, then a low moan that rolled through the aisles like a piece of bad weather. We backed out instead of trying to be brave. I learned a long time ago that the smartest thing you can do in a half-empty store is leave before your nerves decide to argue with your route. On the walk back, we passed a man in a mountain maintenance vest standing beside an abandoned wheelchair in the sleet. He looked at our bags and asked if we had extra water. I told him no. He did not look angry. He just looked tired enough to stop caring whether truth was polite. Then he said there were people gathering near the resort gates because they thought the building still had power and food. That was the first time I realized the lodge would become a target from both sides at once. The pressure came that evening. First, it was a fist on the front lodge doors, then a shouted request for water. Then a woman crying that her brother was upstairs in staff housing and needed help getting out. Then another voice, male and sharp, demanding to know why the resort was hiding supplies when the mountain was on its knees. I stayed behind the office glass and watched shadows move across the outer fence. There were about 6 of them, maybe 7, too many to trust. Not enough to surrender to. I told them through the intercom that the lodge was sealed and that nobody was being let in from the road. The man shouting at the door called me a coward. I did not answer. Then the infected appeared at the far end of the lot. Not a crowd, just one at first, stumbling in the sleet with the stiff wrong motion I had already learned to fear. The people outside saw it and split apart at once. One ran. One tried to drag the woman with him. One stood frozen long enough to make the wrong choice and then bolted the other direction. The infected did not sprint. It just kept coming. I hit the gate lock and pulled the pallet jack in tighter. Wade shoved the supply cart into place. We did not go after the people running down the road, and we did not open the gate for anyone who had just learned what the sound of fear does to a crowd. That night, Lena came to the hatch with a fresh note from the mountain radio board. The county had announced partial lockdown around the resort district. Road access would be controlled. Movement would be restricted. Emergency corridors were being discussed. She read the note once, then looked at me and said the resort would become more crowded before it became safer. I believed her. The next 2 days were about holding the line. I kept the office organized by counts. Water on one shelf, food on another. Medicine in the middle. Batteries in a separate box. Clean gloves on top. Dirty waste sealed and moved out of the main path. I wrote down what we used, what we lost, and what was left. Wade kept the generator cycling. Lena kept the temperature notes moving. Between us, the resort still behaved like something managed. Outside, the mountain got worse. The radio lost pieces of itself first. Then whole stretches. The news tone became clipped and uncertain. Power failures hit more neighborhoods. Transit shut down. The mountain district was described with the kind of language officials use when they are trying not to admit how bad a thing has already become. On the 9th day, the radio finally spoke clearly enough to make me sit down. An official corridor would open the following morning, narrow and supervised, for the mountain district. There would be a movement window, identity checks, escort lanes, controlled exits. The announcer said people should pack only what they could carry and wait for verification. I did not feel relief right away. I felt suspicion first. Wade felt the same. He stood by the generator room door and said if the corridor was real, it would still be real in the morning. Lena came down with her own bag already packed and the face of someone who had stopped hoping for anything that was not tangible. We checked the roofline. We checked the road through the cameras. We checked the emergency alerts against the mountain radio. We compared notes on infected movement, crowd size, and which roads were still dark. We did not trust the announcement just because it sounded hopeful. The corridor held. It held through the first quiet hour. It held when the generator shifted into a lower hum and the building seemed to settle around it. It held when Wade came up from the basement with his wrench in his back pocket and told me the fuel line would last the night if we were careful. It held when Lena brought down the last temperature check from staff housing and said the confused skier was finally drinking water without being told twice. That was the easy part. The hard part was the waiting. The evening before the corridor opened was long enough to change the shape of every sound in the building. Sleet kept tapping the loading canopy in a steady line. The generator kept its rough, stubborn rhythm. The office smelled like hot dust, coffee gone stale, and the cleaner I had used on the floor around the waste bin. Somewhere up in the lodge, a worker was crying in a voice too weak to sound angry. A cartwheel squealed somewhere in the corridor, and then went quiet. I used the calm to do one more sweep of the basement and the lodge lane. The reserve room still held the stock. The food labels were still in place. The water cases were still stacked against the wall in clean rows. The dark corners held nothing important. The path from the office to the gate and from the office to the lift corridor was still simple enough to run in the dark if I had to. That was the point. The building did not need to be pretty. It needed to be predictable. Predictable did not mean quiet. The resort had started making its own small sounds, and by then I knew enough to listen for all of them. A drip near the utility sink. A scrape from a loose panel on the supply rack. A short burst of static from the mountain radio. The bump of a cartwheel that had not been parked quite square. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. I went back down the lift corridor before I let the numbers lie to me. The overhead light had failed again in the far hall, which meant the portable lantern Lena had given me was doing most of the work. The cold air hit my face when I opened the inner door. It always did. The catwalk held its temperature better than the rest of the building, but the corridor still felt wrong when the lights were low. Edges looked too sharp. Shadows under the racks looked deeper. Every sound from my boots on the metal grating echoed twice. At the back of the reserve room, I found the leak I had feared and hoped not to find. It was small. A seam in the wash line under the sink, just enough to drip into the drain pan and spread a dark patch across the concrete. Small leaks become bigger problems in buildings like this because cold keeps water from evaporating quickly. It sits, it creeps, it makes the floor slick. It gives a person one more thing to forget while they are trying to think about everything else. I called for Wade, and he came with a wrench, 2 towels, and the face of a man who would have preferred a larger emergency because larger emergencies are at least honest. We shut the valve, laid the towels down, and moved the lower boxes back from the wall so the water could not travel under the shelving. That work took 15 minutes. It felt longer because the whole resort had started to measure time by interruptions. When we finished, Lena was waiting in the office with a clipboard and a tired look in her eyes. She said the skier and staff housing had finally stopped asking the same question every few minutes. I asked which question. She said whether the corridor was really coming. That made me look at the radio. The radio was still dirty with static, but now and then a clean phrase came through. Controlled movement. Mountain district. Medical checks. Delayed departures. Stay at the marked lane. 1 person per escort group if necessary. It was never enough to be soothing. It was enough to be real. Lena leaned on the office frame and said the skier had answered the temperature checks correctly, which was a better sign than any speech could have been. Then she added that 2 other people on the mezzanine had started talking louder about the corridor because they thought the word itself meant rescue. I told her people always hear the part they want first. She gave me a look that said she had already guessed I would say that. They hear the exit, she said. They ignore the rules. That was exactly right. I went up to the roof access door after that because I wanted to see the street for myself. The mountain looked stripped down from above. Barricades glowed at the far intersection. A line of reflective vests moved in pairs. 1 portable floodlight had been set at the corner near the checkpoint, and it turned the wet pavement into a flat silver strip. That was all. No heroics. No miracle rescue. Just a managed lane through a town that had finally accepted that fewer people die when movement is controlled. I stood there long enough to see a woman with a duffel bag and a child in her arms get guided from one lane to the next without being shoved or rushed. That was the moment I knew the corridor was not a rumor. It was a route. Routes were the only kind of miracle I trusted. When I came back down, Wade was at the generator room door checking the fuel gauge. He said the line was holding but running warm. I asked him how warm was warm. He shrugged and said warm enough to remind him we were still borrowing time. That was one of the better ways he had ever described anything. Lena was down in the lift control room with the skier who had been shaky earlier. She came out a few minutes later with a fresh note in her hand. The note said the fever had dropped again. The confusion had not, but the man was beginning to answer questions with less delay. She had written a second line beneath it. If the corridor fails, keep him in the room with the blanket and water. Do not let him walk the lodge alone. I folded the note and put it in my pocket. That was the thing about the last days of a disaster. Nobody was asking for grand choices anymore. They were asking for the next safe room, the next clean cup, the next time they could sit down without letting the building win. The crew on the mezzanine started making noise again around midnight, not panic, just fatigue and worry and the kind of anger that comes from standing in one place too long. One man kept insisting his sister should move with the first corridor group because she had a cough and should not be waiting any longer. Another said the first group was already too full and that if anyone shoved their way into the line, the whole escort would slow down. Lena handled it the way nurses handle things that are really only about fear. She gave them a list. Who was moving first? Who was staying back? Who had a child? Who needed medication? Who could walk steadily? Who needed a wheelchair? The list looked simple on the page. It was the most useful thing in the room. I wrote the same structure into my notebook because copying good order is sometimes the only way to keep it alive. There was a final noise from outside around 2 in the morning. Somebody on the street side banged on the outer fence and shouted for the resort to answer. I moved to the camera and saw a man in a mountain security jacket with one sleeve torn and a flashlight pointed down. He was not infected. He was cold, wet, and furious. He demanded to know why the building would not open its gate to a family trying to get to the escort line. I told him through the intercom that the lodge was sealed until the next movement call. He yelled that the county had been saying that for hours. I told him I knew, and that yelling at the gate would not make the lane wider. Before he could answer, I saw movement behind him at the edge of the streetlight. One infected figure, then another shape farther back. He saw the first one and started backing up toward the fence instead of away from it, which was exactly the wrong motion and exactly the sort of thing fear makes people do when they want a door more than they want a map. I did not open the gate. I did not call him back. I watched him run around the corner while the infected kept moving along the sidewalk, slower than a person and more dangerous because of it. Wade came up beside me and said the mountain was running out of patience. I told him it had been out of patience before we noticed. He gave a short laugh that had no humor in it and then went back to the generator room. That was the last long stretch before the corridor opened. After that, everything got narrower, quieter, and more honest. I checked my bag again because I did not trust the shape of it. The flashlight sat where I could reach it without digging. The batteries were wrapped in a plastic sleeve so they would not rattle. The notebook was flat against the side pocket. The clean shirt was folded tight enough to survive the trip without catching on the pry bar handle. That sounds small. It mattered more than small things usually do. At the hatch, Lena was dealing with one last problem that had nothing to do with infection and everything to do with timing. The woman with the duffel bag from the upper floors had finally accepted that she would not be moving as part of a big family cluster. Her brother was being sent with her first because he could walk steadily and carry her bag if she needed both hands for the stroller. The child she had been worried about was already with another nurse farther up the hall, wrapped in a blanket and half asleep. Lena explained the split in the same tone she would have used for temperature readings. One person now, one route. One decision at a time. The woman did not like it, but she heard it. That was enough for the moment. Wade came up from the generator room and said the radio had stayed clean for almost 10 minutes, which was the closest thing to a blessing the resort had heard all week. He also said the corridor workers were asking people to stay in the marked lanes and stop crowding the loading end of the block. I told him the crowd would obey for about 5 minutes and then start acting like a crowd again. He snorted and said that was generous. The final hour before movement opened in earnest felt like the inside of a held breath. The generator kept humming. The sleet kept tapping. The lights stayed up. The waste bin stayed sealed. The lodge gates stayed locked until the workers outside signaled for the next group. But the building itself kept shifting under the pressure of people who were ready to leave and people who were not ready to be left behind. Somewhere above us, a man started shouting about a lost phone charger and had to be quieted by 2 nurses and a security guard. Somewhere near the rental desk, a child cried long enough to wake 3 tired adults and then went quiet once the bottle was found. Somewhere in the basement, a cartwheel had to be re-tightened because somebody had shoved too much weight onto it. Those little noises stacked up until the whole resort sounded like a machine with too many loose screws. I went back down the lift corridor one more time to make sure the leak from earlier had not returned. It had not. The towels were still holding the edge of the floor dry. The valve stayed shut. The rack was clear. The dark corner held nothing important. The route from the office to the gate stayed simple. That was the real goal of all the checking. Not control. Familiarity. Familiarity is what lets you move through a bad place without wasting energy on every shadow. When I came back, a security volunteer from the lodge side asked whether we had one extra wheelchair for a man with a twisted ankle who could not make the curb outside. We had one. Of course we did. There was always one more small problem at the end of a crisis. That is how disasters make you tired. They do not only attack the big systems, they fill the corners with minor needs until you start to wonder whether exhaustion itself is one of the symptoms. Wade wheeled the chair up while I watched the corridor monitor. The street outside was getting brighter by degrees, not sunny. Just visible enough to make the barricades look real, and the people walking between them look like they were moving on purpose. Lena came down the hall with her bag over one shoulder and told me the upper floor was ready. She had already written out a list of who was moving first and who was staying back until the next wave. That list was clipped to her clipboard with a red pen through the top corner. I looked at it and saw the thing I had been trying to build all week. Structure, not comfort, not safety. Structure. The woman with the duffel bag was crying without making much sound, which was somehow harder to hear than if she had been shouting. Her brother put a hand on her shoulder and told her they were moving in the right order, which was about the best version of courage I had seen from anybody not wearing a ski jacket or a patrol badge. I passed Lena one of the water bottles from my bag, and she gave it back after taking 2 mouthfuls, because she said she needed the bottle to keep moving. That was the sort of practical selfishness mountain work teaches you to respect. At the radio desk, the unit gave one more clean announcement. The corridor remained open. The next check-in point was active. Movement through the lane would continue until midday. I wrote those words down because I wanted the day to have proof. Then Wade and I moved the last of the spare batteries to the front shelf, not because anybody needed them immediately, but because leaving useful things behind a stack of boxes always made me uneasy. If the resort had taught me anything, it was that the easiest way to lose something in a crisis is to tuck it away one layer too deep and assume you will have time to remember where it went. By the time the worker in reflective gear called for the next group on the road outside, the resort had become almost orderly. Almost. That was enough. Lena touched 2 fingers to the edge of the hatch frame again and said she would see me on the other side if the line held. I told her I planned to make the line hold by walking through it slowly. That got the smallest smile out of her. Wade handed me my pack and told me not to drop the pry bar because he was tired of hearing me talk about habits as if they were a religion. Maybe they were. It was easier to believe in a habit than a miracle. We stood there for one last breath while the generator hummed behind us. The sleet beat on the loading canopy, and the resort around us finally sounded like a place that had done enough work to survive its own bad week. Then I walked back through the lift corridor one last time. The reserve room looked smaller than it had a week ago. The food was still stacked. The labels were still on the bins. The water cases were still where I had set them. The dark corners held nothing important. The path to the exit stayed simple. That was enough. At the outer gate, an emergency worker checked my wristband and pointed me into the marked lane. The street air hit my face first. It smelled like sleet, wet asphalt, and smoke from somewhere I could not see. It also smelled like movement, which was the first clean thing I had breathed in days. I looked back once. The resort stood behind me with its dark windows, its repair lights, and its lift rooms full of the things that had kept us alive. Lena was still inside. Wade was still inside. The building was still dangerous, but it was no longer the only thing standing between me and the town. That was enough to make my next breath come easier. I walked into the corridor with my bag in one hand and my cart in the other. For the first time since the reset, I believed I might actually make it to the other side. The lane was narrower than it looked from the roof. Workers in reflective gear stood at both sides of the road with clipboards, radios, and tired eyes. Nobody was dramatic. Nobody shouted. They checked names, wrists, bags, and temperatures, and they pointed people forward one group at a time. The order of it felt almost strange after the last week. A line can feel like mercy when it keeps a crowd from turning into a stampede. I showed my badge, my wristband, and the paper Lena had signed. One of the workers looked at my face, then at the ski resort in the distance, and said I had been through enough shifts to qualify as a local problem even if I had not been born there. That got the smallest laugh from the pair beside him. He waved me forward. The corridor took us past a checkpoint where an ambulance sat with its rear doors open and a portable heater humming near the curb. A nurse with a clipboard checked a little boy's hands for fever while his mother held a blanket around both of them. A man with a splinted ankle sat on a folding chair and tried to act less relieved than he was. Nobody looked safe yet. But they looked managed. That was close enough for the first hour. When I reached the transfer point, I turned around and saw the resort again through the gray morning. Breckenridge sat high on the mountain like a place that had nearly swallowed itself and then decided not to. The lifts were still stopped. The lodge windows were dark. The service hall held the last of our supplies and the generator with Wade's repair on it. Somewhere inside those walls, Lena was probably still writing names, still checking temperatures, still making sure people who wanted to panic were given numbers instead of rumors. I had the sudden, pointless urge to go back and check the generator gauge one more time. That was a maintenance worker's brain for you. Disaster can take the town, the road, the power, and the radio, and still leave you wondering whether the fuel line is tight enough. The urge passed. I kept moving. At the final checkpoint, an officer with frost on his collar asked whether I knew anyone still inside the lodge. I told him yes. He asked if they had enough food for one more night. I said yes. He asked if they had a working generator. I said yes again, and that felt like the first honest word I had spoken in a while. The officer nodded once and marked something on his form. Then he told me the corridor would stay open as long as the route stayed clear. That was the kind of sentence that lets a person breathe without promising too much. I took the shuttle with the others down toward the lower holding site. The seats were cold. The windows were fogged around the edges. Nobody talked much until the road bent away from the resort and the mountain disappeared behind the dark line of pines. Only then did the woman with the duffel bag put her hand over her mouth and start crying in a way that sounded more like relief than grief. Her brother leaned his forehead against the window and closed his eyes. The child in the blanket fell asleep almost immediately. I watched the ski slopes fade into the gray weather and thought about the first time I had died on that catwalk. In the old timeline, that had been the end of everything. In this one, it had just been a warning written in a language I had finally been allowed to learn. I did not know what would happen after the holding site. I did not know whether Lena and Wade would make it through the next shift, whether the generator would hold, whether the road would stay open, or whether the mountain would try one more ugly trick before letting people leave in peace. But I knew the resort had a chance because we had kept its systems legible. That was the part I understood best. If you can still count the fuel, the water, the light, and the doors, then you are not dead yet. If you can still tell one corridor from another, and one voice from the kind that comes with teeth behind it, then you still have time. And if you can still hear the mountain in the middle of the storm and answer it with something practical, then you are doing better than survival. You are keeping a place alive long enough for other people to cross it. By the time the shuttle reached the lower site, the sky had begun to open in a thin, pale strip over the town. I stepped down with my bag on my shoulder and the smell of sleet in my coat, and I looked once more toward the ridge where the resort sat. There was no way to see Lena from there. No way to see Wade. No way to see the generator room, or the service hall, or the lift control office where the whole thing had started. But I knew the layout in my head, and I knew which doors were still locked, which lights were still on, and which rooms had become safe because people had worked long enough to make them that way. I kept that map with me as I walked into the next checkpoint. It was the only map I trusted.